I guess first question, how have you been doing with the COVID lockdown and pandemic?
How have we all been doing, right? We're spending a lot of time indoors. We live in Stratford, Ontario,
Mhm.
and we've been pretty lucky in this particular region of the province in terms of the numbers. But still, our lives have all changed. We
Mhm.
live a very different life than we did a year ago. And we've all had to adapt to that, and we've all had to ensure that we care not about ourselves, just about ourselves, but about those around us. And I think we're all managing to do that with some exceptions, and I think we all recognize too that the challenge is not over yet. It's going to take a while.
Absolutely. So what led you to put together the book?
Well, it was actually not my idea. It was the idea of Simon and Schuster, the publisher. They came to me about, I guess it would be in the early part of the summer of last year, 2019, with this idea of doing a book that profiled a number of extraordinary Canadians. And that kind of fit exactly with the way that I've often thought. I mean, like you, I've done a lot of interviews. In my case, over 50 years, I've probably done 20,000 interviews. And I've always found that the most interesting people are not the celebrities, are not the well known people, but are actually what we tend to call ordinary people,
Mhm.
but those who have quite extraordinary stories to tell. And, there's no spin in the way they tell their story. They're not looking for publicity. They just are who they are. And you end up talking to them and finding their stories quite fascinating. And so I saw this as an opportunity to do exactly that through this book. I did tell them at that time, early last summer, that I was involved in two major international documentaries, and that I was going to have a hard time meeting their publishing deadline because I was going to be overseas a lot. So I said, I want to bring somebody else in on this and have a co-author. And they said, well, we have ghostwriters. And I said, no, 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 no. I don't want a ghostwriter. I want a co-author, and we'll kind of divide it up. And so that's when I suggested my good friend Mark Bulgutch, who I've worked with for most of the last 30 years at the CBC. He was a lineup editor, assignment editor, executive producer of various programs that I worked on, and now retired, like I am, in the sense that we're retired, but we're working harder than we did when we were, when we were retired. But, so we he loved the idea of doing it, and Simon and Schuster liked the idea as well. So that's how the two of us got involved, and off we went.
In reading the stories, they kind of often start off not great circumstances for a lot of people, but then by the end, these people have overcome a lot of challenges. So, do you feel these inspirational stories are something that we actually need right now, especially not something you could have foreseen a year ago?
That's the thing. I had no idea that we'd plant this book in the middle of the kind of year that we're having now, that never seems to stop with its twists and turns. Um, but I I think a book like this is always good for people because it is inspiring on so many different levels, but especially good this year because I think we need to remind ourselves that there are difficulties that we all face, and then there are some individual difficulties where the challenge is met, and that we can all learn from it. And that's what we've got in a lot of these stories. Because you're absolutely right; they start off, many of them do, with a sense of, oh my gosh, this is going to be a difficult story to read, and then you through the understanding and learning about the person at the center of the story, you realize, man, I wish I had that kind of determination. I wish I had that kind of inspiration to tackle the challenge in front of me, and then realizing by the end that, maybe I do have that, and I just haven't shown it before. And so, I think that's one of the great values of a book like this.
In the piece by Cindy Blackstock, she speaks about the racism that she faced as an Indigenous person. Uh, we're obviously more aware of it now, but is racism against Indigenous something that is still kind of too often ignored by Canadians?
Oh, I think so. I often tell the story of when I started in the business in the late 60s, was in northern Manitoba. I was in Churchill working at a very small radio station. It was like 50 watts or something. Couldn't hear it 2 blocks from the station. But the one of the issues that became very evident very quickly to me, as somebody who'd moved there from the South. I'd come out of a privileged background, middle class, uh, Canada, living in Ottawa, and then suddenly I was living in Churchill, Manitoba, where it was very much a community of different backgrounds and different cultures, and racism was absolutely evident, like wherever you went. So I saw this for 3 years, and one of the things that I've found myself doing when I interview whether they're Indigenous leaders or non-Indigenous leaders about the issue of racism in Canada, I say to them, when I started in the business in the late 1960s, I found myself asking the questions of people like you that I'm still asking today.
Mhm.
We're still confronted. Have there been advancement and changes? Absolutely. And, many for the good, but we're still a long way from it. And, that's what the Murray Sinclair Commission was all about, looking at what in fact was kind of the issue of racism in Canada through residential schools, through the murdered and missing women and children and girls in the Indigenous community. So, so many of those questions still linger. Cindy Blackstock, there are 17 people in this book. And, I'm not going to go through all their stories or no reason to buy the book. But most of these 17 people, neither Mark nor I had ever met before, and didn't know anything about. Some of them we did. Cindy Blackstock, in my case, I knew about Cindy because I'd interviewed her about 5 years ago in one of the stages of her big legal challenge in one of the major courts in Canada about the discrimination for Indigenous kids compared with non-Indigenous kids within the school system. And so I'd met her before, and when I'd met her, I thought this person's really interesting. I want to know kind of more about her. And so when I started doing this book, I thought right away of Cindy Blackstock. I got to talk to her. So I contacted her, and we got into a series of discussions, and it certainly broadened my understanding of kind of who she is and where she comes from on this issue. Because when she starts talking, as you saw, Craig, in the book, about her first years, her early years, with a Indigenous father and a non-Indigenous mother, and the different way she was treated depending on which parent she was with, struck to the very heart of this issue of racism within Canada. And watching it through the eyes of what was at that time was a 3 or 4 year old kid, trying to make sense of it all and trying to understand why it was different, why she was being treated differently. It was quite, gripping, quite the story, and then led through her what has been a remarkable life to this point, and will only obviously continue to be so.
Mhm. One common theme through some of the stories is somebody coming from elsewhere in the world and coming to Canada and finding success. And Frances Wright was kind of a really good example of that in the book. So, what makes Canada kind of a place that a lot of people do want to come to? It's not perfect, but they do want to come here for a better life.
You got that right. It's not perfect, and that's one of the things this book does and signals to you that as wonderful and as inspirational as these stories are, they are actually stories about people who have to face challenges within our country to try and make life better, not just for themselves but for others in similar kinds of situations. So it's constantly reminding us of the challenges that are still ahead for what is a great country like ours. Why do people come here? Because of the opportunity. Because we're young, we're dynamic. There are lots of opportunities within our country, and when you travel the world, as I've done, and I imagine you've done a bit as well, when you tell people, "Hey, I'm from Canada, I'm a Canadian," they look at you like, "Oh boy, you're so lucky." And we are lucky, and
Mm.
we tend to forget that at times, that we're lucky. Take a person like Frances Wright, who I think I first met when I was covering the famous Five statue being placed in Ottawa, which is a tribute, obviously, to women who had made such a difference in our country, and the ability of women to do things they'd never been allowed to do before. Um, she struck me immediately as somebody who was focused, who wanted to achieve a goal, who was convinced she knew how to do it, and that she could do it in a way where she would create more friends and more influence, not less. And she's never stopped. I mean, obviously, the women's issue has been huge on her radar. But like 2 years ago, she called me up. 2 or 3 years ago, she called me up and she said, "Peter, I'm wondering if you'd come out to Calgary, where she lives, um, to give a speech to a noon hour group where I'm trying to raise money for the cause of," and I'm thinking, okay, it's going to be another cause about women. But she said, "No, this cause is about abuse of men." And I thought, wow, this woman, you can't stop her. She's like amazing. She's always thinking of trying ways to try and make life better for those around her. And I went out and I did the speech, and she was extremely grateful. But she's just like all of the others in this book. Is a remarkable person. And as you will have noticed, I mean, the people in this book are all very different. I mean, one of the goals that Mark and I had right from the get-go was, we want this book to reflect the diversity of our country in a lot of different ways, whether it's geographically, whether it's gender-wise, whether it's culture-wise, whether it's by profession, whatever. And so what you've got here is 17 people, very different people, who have all made a mark in different areas of the country, but they're all marks that we can all learn from. And that was the one of the more enjoyable factors of this book.
The story of Susan Rose was especially kind of shocking because we've made a lot of headway in the past 20 years with LGBTQ, but do we still have a long way to go for inclusion and acceptance, which is something that her story had a lot of, especially being a teacher?
Oh yeah. In many of the areas in this book, it's an indication of how we still have a long way to go on certain areas. It could be an area as traditional and historic as the issue of the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians, or it could be an issue that seems for most Canadians to be much more recent, and that's the various issues surrounding LGBTQ. If you'd raised this issue 10 years ago, most people wouldn't know what you were talking about. They wouldn't have been able to define those initials. Today, it's much more obvious to most Canadians, but the issues are still not completely resolved. And perhaps not surprisingly, I think we have a much more inclusive attitude in this country now in a lot of areas, but we still got ways to go. And you can see that on the way, some Canadians react to stories like this. So to answer your question, basically, absolutely, we still have a long way to go, and it's people like Susan Rose who are helping us get there.
Like I said, I don't want to go through all 17 people. So, kind of the last person I'll touch on was one of my favorite stories. It was Jessica Grossman. And I know for me, if my internet goes out, it's, this is the worst thing that can possibly happen. But, here's this girl who's spent almost her entire childhood dealing with horrible pain and surgery, and she overcomes all of that. And so, reading stories such as hers, do you feel like people will find their own ways to overcome their own adversaries using people like her as an example?
I hope so, because hers is a great example. Um, Mark wrote that story, and my co-author, Mark Bogich, And I've never asked him directly, but I'm assuming that one of the reasons he was fascinated by Susan's story was that he himself has spent most of his life dealing with the impact of Crohn's disease, which is the major issue that faced um,
Jessica.
Jessica. But you know, I think her story, you don't have to have Crohn's disease to be impacted by her story. You just have to have a challenge and to understand that there are people who've met challenges with much more severe difficulties than most of us will ever face. And they've met those challenges head on. And we can draw inspiration from the way they've done it. But I also think that connecting it back to your earlier story about Frances Wright is that people come to Canada because of opportunity. Um, in Canada, sometimes those of us who've grown up here don't appreciate that as much as perhaps we should. But in facing these challenges that many of them have done, it also is something for us to recognize that the journey of Canada is really only just begun. Still lots of room for us to make improvement on various aspects of our life.
In the end, what's the main message that you want to get out to people through the book?
That's a good question. Um, I think the main message is that we're a country of, my dad used to say to me, he was a public servant. He's passed now for a number of, more than 10 years. But he was a senior public servant, did extremely well in both the Canadian government and the Alberta government. He used to say to me as I was growing up, when we moved to Canada, we came from Britain, and we'd sit around the dining room table, my sister and I and my little brother, and he'd pull out a map, or he'd look at a map of Canada, and he'd say, this is such an enormous country that when you look at it and you recognize the diversity of it, just simply in geography and resources, it almost appears to be ungovernable.
Mhm.
Well, a lot of people around the world might look at it that way, but we chose to make it governable in the sense of joining together, joining forces, or the tensions there always are in a big country like ours. But we take inspiration and lessons from the kind of people who are in this book about how to confront challenge, how to face challenge for the common good, not just their own personal good. And I think that's what's perhaps behind the secret of this book. That one, we're a pretty special country, we're a pretty lucky country, but it doesn't all happen automatically. As John Turner, who we just buried a few weeks ago, used to say, democracy doesn't happen by accident. You got to participate. And part of that participation is the kind of stories that are they're dotted through this book, that the people have met challenges in a way that we can draw inspiration from and meet the challenges that confront us. They may be small in comparison, certainly, to some of these stories, but they're still challenges nonetheless.
Absolutely. And then just my last question, it's kind of hard to say, especially with 2020 being the way it is, but what's coming up for you as we move into 2021?
I don't know, quite frankly. I've still got these documentaries that I do, but the problem is with COVID, you can't travel. So I've had to put stuff on the shelf. I started doing a daily podcast, not quite the excitement level of yours with your fancy background, but but I started doing this nightly podcast because of COVID back in March, thinking that, it'll be a month, 6 weeks or whatever, and then we'll be moving on. Here I am, whatever it is, 34, 35 weeks later, still doing it. Now, you're lucked in with having another crazy story in the sense of the US election to play with as well. But I've actually really enjoyed doing it, and I've had a number of approaches on the part of those who would like to sponsor or buy the distribution rights my podcast. Um, so I've got to think seriously about that, because right now, probably a little bit like you, I do it out of my home, I do it out of my office. It's all very sort of kind of Mickey Mouse, really. I don't have a fancy microphone like you do, I, but it's fun to do, and I'm sure you find it fun to do as
Mhm.
well. And so I will, give that some thought as well. Another book, entirely possible. I might do that. I give a lot of speeches. I sit on 5 boards, so I'm still busy. As I said earlier, I think that I find myself at times as busy as I was when I was hosting the national. Um, there are days when I think, oh my gosh, why couldn't I just be doing the national again? It's so much easier. But it's all fun. Life is good.